Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of KammaKast, the video cast where we speak to lots of interesting people around the real estate and financial services industry. Today, we're very lucky to have Will Emtage with us. Will is Associate Director of ESG and Sustainability for RPS Group, and we're very excited to learn more about the wonderful kind of innovative stuff they're doing in that space. Will, thanks for coming to join us.
Orla, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be joining you guys today and speak to your audience. Um, so I'm from RPS, and I just maybe give a very brief introduction to RPS. We're a global consultancy with about 5,000 people globally in various offices, and we have always had, right from the very beginning, sustainability at our core. Um, RPS actually stands for, originally in the 1970s when we were set up, Rural Planning Services. Now, our business offering has developed significantly since that point, but I only mention it to say that that focus on environment and sustainability, that theme, is something that has grown with us along the way. Um, and my role very much fits into that. So, as you just mentioned there, I'm Associate Director for ESG and Sustainable Business. And ESG, I suppose, is sustainability in the very broadest sense. The E standing for environment, the S for social, and G for governance, which is kind of like the uh, the the brain of ESG, through which all kind of decision making is filtered and through which various environmental and social priorities get ranked. Um, so yeah, that's a brief summary, and I'm really excited to talk to you today, and kind of bounce some ideas and share ideas about what's trending in the market at the moment, and perhaps pry open some of the reasons why.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly we came across RPS because to a certain degree you are quite a trailblazer in the space of ESG, and we're very interested in net zero in particular, so the kind of E in the ESG, because there's such a huge focus all of a sudden in the last number of years around the built environment, with the kind of the
Yeah.
need to do more in this space so that we do hit our net zero targets. So can you tell us a little bit more about how net zero is, how it sits within your kind of service and business mix?
Yeah, so net zero is uh, probably what one of the most significant trends that we see at the moment in terms of um, work that clients, existing clients, contact us about, but also a source of new clients as well. Um, the requests that we get in terms of net zero come from almost every different sector of the economy, but real estate is particularly notable, um, because real estate accounts for a very large portion of emissions. There are a lot of different factors which are driving that trend. So there are new disclosure requirements, for example. TCFD is something that many people may have heard of. It's originally began as a voluntary disclosure standard, and relates to the financial impacts of climate risk. Um, that forces, now that it's become a mandatory standard, that forces a lot of firms to really get to grips with their net zero strategy. Because if you're going to be disclosing information, you don't want it to look bad. So you now need to have a strategy in place to reduce your emissions. And this is very true of real estate, but it's also true of lots of sectors. The corporate sector are looking at this very closely, um, but also industrials, chemical industries, industries which are highly reliant on water in particular, and obviously the energy sector too. So this is incredibly broad. There's a real surge of interest, but there's a lot of challenge involved as well, because for many organizations, it's a new theme, and there are all kinds of questions about how you grapple with net zero, how you measure where you are, how you strategize about where you want to get to, um, and also how you fund this and integrate it with your business case, and turn it into a viable proposition, and potentially a source of value creation as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And just to kind of touch on the TCFD point, it is
Mhm.
obviously becoming a key driver in, forcing businesses to get their house in order around their net zero strategy, and particularly seen as, most G7 countries have made it mandatory. I know here in the UK, as of April 2022, listed companies
Yeah.
and financial institutions need to disclose on this basis. So it's becoming as important as reporting your revenue accurately in your financial
Yeah.
statements, which is a fantastic step change, particularly because it's on an international and global basis. What other catalysts have you seen for kind of this kind of change in perception in net zero, or do you see a big change in perception from your clients as well?
There, yeah, there are a whole number of catalysts. I mean, the most recent driver is actually the inflationary pressure that a lot of firms are facing. So, in terms of operating costs in particular, um, very visceral spikes in energy prices. Um, you see a lot of firms, for example, even just 12 months ago, might have been paying somewhere between 14 and 16 pence per kilowatt hour for electricity. That is now north of 34 pence, sometimes reaching 40. And uh, that type of cost pressure forces a very sharp reaction in terms of business strategy. Um, and the more energy consumptive a business is, the more quickly they're willing to act on it. And that drives attention around net zero. How can we reduce emissions is a very interesting proxy for how we can reduce energy consumption and therefore energy costs. Um, and there are different ways of attacking that. Sometimes the aim is to attack that from the supply side. You know, how can we source more renewable energy? But there's also the demand side. How can we reduce consumption of energy in the first place? Um, and there are various kind of energy efficiency measures around that, for example.
So that's a really interesting point. Kamma are members of the Green Finance Institute, and their mission or their raison d'etre is around kind of the incentivizing the private sector. So kind of trying to put forward the business case as to why you should do this in a kind of great but absolutely awful way in other ways, because rising fuel costs is not good for many reasons. But it is forcing net zero. It's forcing a much more accelerated pace with which we need to get on top of it. And I think that is also why, because we work across real estate and financial services, that you're seeing a much kind of bigger increase in demand or increased interest, because this is hitting companies in the pocket. And once
Yeah.
you bring money into it and you can kind of make the business case around that, suddenly change starts to happen. And we kind of we're seeing suddenly kind of an increase in this transition risk, so the risk around a quick transition to a low carbon economy. But it's also fantastic to see that it creates opportunities as well. So it's not just all kind of stick, that there's carrot there as well. So yeah, it's fascinating the way kind of I guess sometimes the weird things come together to actually have a positive kind of outcome as well. Well, we hope anyway.
I think that's very true, Orla, and that focus on what the opportunity is and how you frame that is absolutely critical. So at the moment, yes, there's a real um, opportunity to make that business case because of the rise in energy costs. As you say, that's hitting businesses in the pocket. Um, but you need more than that, and I think that's where I'm really interested to have some discussion with you today, because there you also need the one piece of the jigsaw puzzle is data, which is what you guys specialize in terms of making sure that uh, firms have the data available to benchmark where they are, to assess where they would like to get to, and that they can measure their progress over time and actually report that clearly. Um, from our side, particularly as an ESG advisor, in addition to the data, there's the need for a guiding strategy around net zero enhancements that businesses might pursue. So it's not enough just to have measurables, but you need to fit those measurables into the different segments of the economic DNA of a client. So depending on what sector your client is sitting in, there will be certain revenue drivers and cost drivers that are unique to them. There will be certain drivers behind asset valuations, certain drivers behind cost of capital. All of these things fit together to unlock enterprise value for a business. And what we want to do is pair the data side of things uh, with a strategy that overlays right directly on top of all the drivers behind that enterprise value, so that whether it's an investment committee or a business or a CIO or a chief operating officer that you're speaking to on the other end, they can actually see how this roadmap plays out in language that they can understand. And that's actually pretty fundamental from the ESG perspective. Environmental, social, and governance concerns have always existed, but part of the problem in the past is that they were seen as particularly fluffy or nebulous, not really having much shape or definition. And the change that we have seen over the past 5 years is that increasingly these concerns are being re-rendered in financial terms that investors and business heads can recognize and respond to effectively.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic to hear. And going back to the point on data, how do you find clients have a lot of data on these subjects, or is it, because it's such an emerging area, our experience has been that most companies haven't been gathering this data. Maybe you're very top end kind of commercial real estate where it's a very modern building, but do you think there is kind of a gap in the accessibility of data for most clients in this space?
Well, I would distinguish between um, accessibility of data and actually having aggregated and structured it properly. Um, in most cases, we find that clients are able eventually to assemble the data together that's required to establish a baseline for their emissions and their energy and so on. Um, but initially, that can be a very, very laborious process because it's not something that it's not a business process that they have hardwired in the past. So it becomes this particularly unique ad hoc task where they're trying to gather data from different sections within their business that don't normally speak to one another. Um, and also benchmark that against uh, market data or kind of do peer comparisons, for example, within their sector. Um, it's not impossible, but it can be particularly difficult. The other challenge around data that we see clients having is not just gathering, but interpreting and then making it operationally useful. And I think for anyone working in the data space, that particular point around operational utility and uh, how that data is going to feed through the strata of a business is quite important, because if you don't take that into consideration, it just becomes a bunch of hieroglyphics that land on someone's desk at a client business, and they're not really sure either how to make sense of it, or if they do, it's only on a basic level and they don't really know how to extract the maximum economic value from the data that they're looking at. So there's an education process around that too.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. I think it's emerging. Everybody's learning a lot, and everybody's kind of at some stage of the journey. Some companies more advanced than others, depending on how well, either kind of how innovative they are or how quickly they've been forced to adopt it. But that is a really interesting point that you made around kind of the importance of understanding the broader aspects of the net zero business case
Yeah.
for companies. Could we dig into some of these kind of cost-effective net zero enhancements that kind of hone in on? Like, so what are kind of some of the top ones that kind of do make the business case for companies at the moment?
Sure. So, I mean, let's take, for example, in the real estate sector, let's look at property developed companies or real estate investment trusts, which account for a huge swathe of the market, often have very, very large portfolios, geographically distributed in many cases. Um, Net zero, obviously, is a very, very important theme, but cost effectiveness is the key linchpin to that business case. And uh, on the one side of the ledger, you can tally up the costs of various net zero enhancements, but what about the benefits? And that's where you really have to understand the DNA of the the client business. So for a real estate investment trust, for example, um, you're not just looking at how do we get energy efficiency in real estate assets and buildings, um, but how does energy efficiency drive the key revenue triggers for
Yeah.
that business, such as occupancy levels, for example? What about rental yields? What about asset valuations? Um, and then you can ask the intelligent questions of the data. What data will help support and validate and interrogate those connections between energy efficiency and the occupancy levels, rental yields, and asset valuations? Um, you might also want to look outside of the business at data sources. So in terms of asset valuations, for example, you might want to look at the valuation spreads between brown and green assets, for example. Um, there's been some very kind of interesting data that has emerged recently, that's been termed brown discounting, where effectively real estate funds um, have had to write down the value of significant portions of assets which are performing very badly in terms of emissions and energy efficiency, etc. Um, and that difference between a write down in value of brown assets and an appreciation in value of green assets, that is an opportunity cost for many businesses. If they aren't able to shift their assets into that green category, they risk losing value, or at minimum not being able to capitalize on a rise in asset values over time. So um, those types of factors feed into the business case. There's one more as well, which is slightly trickier, and that is, again, in the case of REITs, one of the key metrics that REITs look at is the weighted average of unexpired lease terms. So across their portfolio, their assets will be leased out to various tenants for different lengths of time. And in an inflationary environment in particular, which is what we're experiencing now to a particularly sharp degree, um, there's often a driver to try and extend those lease terms as much as possible, so that um, you have security of income, in other words.
Yeah.
And again, that's something which intersects with net zero. How do net zero enhancements uh, how are they going to be positioned, most effectively positioned throughout the portfolio, given that it's comprised of lots of different types of assets with lots of different types of tenants? How can you roll those out in a way that is going to prioritize the extension of lease terms by the tenants who are your customers?
Really interesting. Yeah, you can see how all these things intersect, and it's almost like a kind of a domino effect where particularly I think it's definitely happening in the commercial real estate space at the moment that because the business case is so clear that a very energy inefficient building is going to cost you a lot more over time in these times where we're still dependent on fossil fuels. Similarly, a lot of the limited partnerships or institutions that would fund a lot of these big developments, ultimately they're kind of pension funds where your consumers are now kind of really holding them to account on their
Yeah,
ESG strategies as well. So they also don't want it's harder to find capital, and that capital, as you mentioned, where you have the brown discounts, is harder to find if you're in one of these buildings that is emitting a lot of carbon and very energy inefficient. And then you can absolutely see, even on the residential space, that it might not be happening yet, but come next winter, when everybody experiences energy bills that are 3 or 4 times what they're used to, that you will vote with your feet, and you will be, if you're looking for a rental property, you're going to be wanting that property to be at least an EPCC now. And as a landlord, you're probably going to have to put up with discounted rents if you haven't upgraded. And the broader thing is that there is a law coming in to force landlords to be an EPCC by
yeah,
2028. So I do get quite excited, mainly because I'm not a big real estate owner, because they're probably thinking it's a big headache. But it kind of, when you start to talk about it in this way of everything intersecting, you can see the
yeah,
momentum building, and how we are actually going to start achieving what we set out to, and it isn't actually lip
yeah.
service, because the economics of it is starting to make sense.
It's really interesting that you raise residential real estate as well, because of course it's a critical part of our economy. I mean, we all need to have places to live. Um, uh, and the stakeholders that surround residential real estate are also responding to this. Um, there's increasing traction we see behind the scenes around green mortgages, for example, where um, mortgage providers are looking at how they can structure a business case that will offer discounted interest rates to mortgage holders which are able to improve the energy efficiency of their home. And there are various ways that you might go about doing this to ensure that those uh, energy efficiency enhancements are actually validated in order to produce the results. But the business case is there, and a lot of lending institutions, particularly those that still retain some kind of footprint in the EU, are subject, of course, to EU taxonomy regulations and the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and so on. That forces them to disclose the proportion of their assets which are green, which qualify against sustainability criteria laid out in the EU taxonomy definitions. And this puts a pressure on providers of finance and lenders, including mortgage lenders, to improve that ratio, the green asset ratio of their lending. And one of the ways of doing that is by offering incentives through discounted interest rates to mortgage holders. So there is actually a business case around that as well. And again, all of this is thematically incredibly interesting. But when it comes down to actually laying out a financial model that works for clients, that's viable, you need data. You need to be able to quantify uh, all of these different factors that we're talking about. So it's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And we work with mortgage lenders as well, providing the data to help them kind of look at these risk and opportunity strategies. And it is really interesting because not only is there the EU taxonomy that you were just mentioning, that the UK government is also looking to use mortgage lenders as a lever to push the net zero agenda as well. And so
Yeah,
there is a consultation from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, kind of known as BEIS, that proposes that mortgage lenders will have to have an average EPC across their back book by 2030. It really isn't that far
yeah,
away. So this is why you're kind of starting to see some of these finance products trickle out onto the market. And I think we'll see a lot more because there is quite a lead time to bring in a new finance, particularly something that is this is quite innovative when you consider like what mortgages traditionally are. But also the minimum energy efficiency standard does introduce the credit risk into the system because come 2028, when they kind of confirm what that date is, at the moment it's proposed as the end of 2028. If your landlords haven't met the EPCC standard, all of a sudden that will not be a cash generating asset anymore because it'll be
yeah,
illegally let out. And what do you do about
yeah,
that? So there's a lot of levers kind of being turned in different ways, kind of aimed at different very influential industries because when we think about real estate, we don't automatically think about the mortgage lenders, but like they're a huge part of it because they
yeah,
fund most of it. And we are starting to see some quite interesting products. I was reading an article during the week where someone just commented that their mortgage lender said they would scrap their arrangement fee if they were able to get their property up to an EPCC. Now, for some
yeah,
people, that could be just a case of going out and spending a few hundred quid on a hot water cylinder, but for other people that could be putting about 10 to 15 grand into the property, and
yeah,
depending on the valuation of that property, is that feasible? It will be really interesting to watch this space to see kind of different ways in which different institutions think about it and see how they can incentivize that change as well. And certainly from like speaking to our clients, everybody is quite excited about, everybody does want to work in an impactful way, like most people do. Okay, maybe not everybody,
yeah,
but I think being able to weave this into your work and know that you're contributing to creating a really much needed kind of systemic change that is kind of quite rewarding as well. So I think we will see more and more of that, hopefully, or maybe like in my least cynical way. I do believe that that will happen.
I think you're absolutely right, Orla. And In fact, we see some of this happening already. And what's really interesting again, in residential real estate is that there's such interest in this. It's not just falling to the responsibility of homeowners to to find a solution in order to access kind of lower interest rates. Um, Actually there are businesses that are realizing now that the size of the addressable market here, and we see firms, for example, that over the past 3-4 years have been doing pilot studies um, to commercialize a proposition around different technologies that can be either retrofitted into homes um, or finding ways that existing technologies within homes can speak to one another and share data with one another to improve energy efficiency. So um, we'll have all heard, for example, about efforts to coordinate technologies like air source heat pumps, for example, for
Mhm.
heating in the homes with battery storage and getting those hooked up with rooftop solar generation. And getting those technologies in is one value add, but then getting them to share data and speak to one another intelligently, um, getting an kind of algorithmic control in place that balances the tenant preferences for their kind of comfort settings for the home with what's economical in terms of energy management is a whole second layer of value adds. And then, of course, you can hook those two layers up intelligently with weather forecast data that will tell you what the ambient temperatures are likely to be and so on, to add another layer of energy efficiency. And each step along that way, we're seeing more and more value get generated, not just for tenants in terms of reducing their energy bills, um, not just for the environment in terms of reduced carbon emissions, but also for the mortgage lenders as well and the housing associations. It's again really important to their asset valuations. And when you consider the size of lending in this particular space and the actual uh, quantity or in terms of assets and their valuations, uh, an improvement of even a couple of percent uh, is actually gargantuan in terms of realized value for lending institutions. So what you see is a triangulation between different stakeholders here. You've got lending institutions, you've got householders and tenants, um, and then you've got businesses which are setting up to coordinate the action of different technologies within the home, often as part of what's now called the Internet of Things. Getting these technologies to work to the benefit of all the stakeholders involved is a very exciting space.
It is a really exciting space. Definitely makes it easier to get up in the morning when you're working on these things, I think. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we've kind of running out of time now. So I'd just like to thank you for some very interesting, stimulating, and thought-provoking conversations. I definitely learned a few things or two that I hadn't really thought about in terms, particularly in terms of the kind of the business case around the cost effective net zero strategy and the different kind of elements within that and how some of these institutions are thinking about it. Can you share a little bit about some of the projects that you're working on in RPS that are particularly pertinent in this area?
So that there's a variety of different types of clients and different projects, most of which are related in some way or another to the real estate sector. Um, we do advisory work for airports, for example, for car dealerships, which are looking to kind of add another layer of purpose to otherwise unproductive roof space in terms of solar generation and so on. But we also do a lot of work with housing developers and property developers and REITs as well. And at each step in a way, we're trying to help them formulate what the business case needs to be to drive net zero forward. Um, and it's really about helping clients target their spending effectively. We can provide a lot of technical advisory work about how to reach net zero, but we are pairing that with that business case and that strategy so that they understand what the headroom for improvement is and across their portfolios, and they can weight that headroom for improvement by the prospective increases in revenue flow or decreases in costs, uh, and therefore be able to allocate capital where it's going to drive the most impact. And that's, I guess, that's what we specialize in, irrespective of what the project or the particular client is. That's the driving theme and organizing principle behind the service offerings that we have.
Fantastic. Yeah, it sounds like you've got a really broad range of clients, so very kind of different approaches to net zero, I can imagine. So definitely very interesting work and much needed. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Orla. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today as well. And it's always great to kind of bounce these ideas with someone as kind of enthusiastic and switched on as yourself. So let's keep these conversations going. And it's I think that there's an awful lot of potential here that's still untapped that we can get into.
Likewise, I think the more we can collaborate on these things across the board, the more we can achieve together. That sounds very like
Yeah,
la happy days, but I do kind of believe that. But
yeah,
yeah, let's definitely stay in touch and have more chats in the future.
cool, cool.
Thanks for sharing and thanks for a fantastic chat. Hopefully we will speak to you soon.